Good morning. I'm always terrified that the technology won't work, so far so good. So I'm very honored to be here this morning. My objective is to give you a sense of how we made decisions about technology in the language programs at Stanford. These decisions are rooted in the research base in second language acquisition specifically, and more generally in the learning research base. As director of the Language Center, I've always tried to use those particular principles as guiding lights. By that I mean, I never thought we should be diverted by bright, shiny objects. So whether that's a new bell or whistle that's now commonly termed an app, or whether it's a set of miracle promises like you might see on television advertising with Rosetta Stone or Duolingo, but rather that we should always be guided by what the research actually says we should do. So the Stanford Language Center was established in 1994 by the University Senate. The Senate charge to the Language Center was the following. It was to ensure that Stanford language programs were excellent. It was to provide professional development for the teaching staff. It was to establish a research program in second language learning, and it was to infuse technology into the language learning process. To ensure that we had excellent language programs, we needed to make sure that students could listen, speak, read, and write in the language of their choice so that they could live, work, study, and research in non-English speaking settings. Please note, I did not say so that they could get 100% or an A on their grammar exams. So there was a controversy in my field at the time, fomented by a societal interest in practical language use, that is, doing rather than knowing, and a growing body of research into the linguistics of second language acquisition. That body of research was focused on the developmental aspects of language learning and how language was driven by social needs. So second language learning was similar to what Clark and Clark on this campus had found in the previous decade with first language learners. Second language learners do not learn one set of forms, such as the present tense, and then move to the present perfect, and then end up with the simple past. Or as a more concrete example, you can listen to non-native speakers, the ones that surround us every day, and you can hear learners at different developmental levels just of question formations. They go from what time it is, to what time is it, to embedded questions like, do you know what time is it, to the correct form, do you know what time it is? The problem that we had was that teachers were still working on what was convenient in textbooks, like this. Chapter 1, the present tense. Chapter 2, nouns. Chapter 3, the simple past. Chapter 25, embedded questions, or my personal favorite, chapter 27, the subjunctive, the present subjunctive, the past subjunctive, subjunctive and indirect discourse, and indirect questions. Oi. So we had lots of learners who got 100% on their tests and quizzes on all of these forms, doing perfectly the embedded questions in a test format, but then they'd walk out of their classroom and say something like, do you know when does the movie start? So then there's technology. You should be laughing. We blended and flipped eons ago in foreign language learning. So here's an iconic view. Students went to a lab to do drill and practice, and those were things that had been removed from the classroom and put into some sort of technical format because teacher presence really wasn't necessary. Little footnote here, we couldn't find a picture of the lab in the old Meyer building that's now a giant pit. But I can assure you when I walked into the lab in 1995, it looked just like this. The only difference was there was carpet on the floor. So anyway, we had a curricular problem, we had a professional development problem, and we had, most importantly, a learning problem. So that's what I arrived with to begin implementation in 1995. That's 20 years and 3 weeks ago. I reported to John Etchemendy. Those of you who are not from Stanford, you will know he is our provost. I still remember standing in his office in Building 1 when he was an associate dean, explaining that what we first had to do was get baseline on students' abilities, all of their abilities, not just their grammar scores, and that meant assessing their oral use of the language, and more importantly, we had to increase the amount of time that students spend in speaking. So this brings me then to invoke research beyond second language learning, and that is the general learning literature. And the first principle that you find, no matter which study you look at, is time on task, and a second principle called targeted feedback. If you want learners to do well, you have to give them lots of time to practice the task, and you have to tell them what they do well and what they need to be able to do to get better. So I explained to John, again, this was 1995, that what we needed was a way to have students be able to speak and receive feedback every day. And couldn't we carry audio on the computer and ultimately have teachers respond via the computer? So here's what happened in 1995-96. If we needed to do an oral assessment of incoming students to establish baseline, we needed to have time for that. So how do you get time for that? Somewhere scrunched in Frosh orientation between the band run and the chemistry placement test. You should all be laughing. The band run is a tradition around here. Okay, well, you have to get rid of the written part, so we did. We put the written part on the web, and for the price of an Apple IIe, Scott Stalker, who's still around this campus, set up a written placement testing system for us. All he asked me for is if I would buy him a new computer. So he set up a system that to this day is still running. This is a screenshot from the Spanish placement test. So we were the first university to make web-based testing like this happen. That was back in the day when there were no universal character systems and we had to use screenshots of Chinese and Russian. It really looked awful, as you can imagine. So in spite of the skepticism, there was a huge amount of skepticism about web-based testing. And I had a faculty member tell me, quote, this is a direct quote, I will never forget it, "Stanford students are not ready for the web." Okay. We forged ahead, and we found that we got appropriate test statistics. We could more deeply and thoroughly analyze what students could do grammatically. We could trace their development, and we enhanced the accuracy of our individual placements. But then, how do we do the oral exam? Well, think about this. You have about 800 students who have to take an oral exam inside of 1 hour. Well, that means, first of all, they have to all talk at the same time, and somehow you have to capture that performance with some kind of consistency. So the consistency part wasn't all that tough. We used a tool called the Soapy. You'll hear me say this frequently in the remainder of the talk, the Simulated Oral Proficiency Interview. This is a set of tasks that gets increasingly more difficult as the test goes on. The tool was developed through years of analysis at the Center for Applied Linguistics and is rooted in work at the Foreign Service Institute. So we had a viable national level tool, but how do you get the simultaneous talk? Well, you take one of these and you take one of these, and you give the students some directions about what to do with this thing. And then sometimes you have kids sit on the floor, and if they're close to an outlet, or others, you give them a power strip, and they all speak at the same time into one of those cassette recorders. So ultimately, we got really high tech, and we decided to use batteries, and So then it looked like this. So about 10 years into this system, students started complaining. They weren't complaining about speaking at the same time, but they were complaining about this and what the hell this was, okay? So that's when we knew we had to go digital. Looks like this. But we were still doing 800 exams all at the same time, and that's what I want to show you. So this is a picture of Dinkelspiel Auditorium. This is around 400 kids in the first phase of placement testing. In Spanish, we generally do 2 phases.
The school or institution where you're taking this test.
Me gustaría conocerte mejor. ¿Dónde vives?
Okay, that gives you a flavor, and we still do this to this very day. By the way, I should add that, so all of these exams are assessed over the next 7 to 8 hours, and students receive their placement generally around 5 or 6 in the afternoon. But the remark is always made, oh, but they could do that on the computer. Well, not so fast. At no time around here are there 800 computers configured with the correct tests that can deliver them within a 1-hour time frame. So anyway, that was placement testing. Now what about actually solving things on the computer, about increasing the actual amount of speaking time in classes? Our instructors were at the forefront of developing what is now called a learning management system. It wasn't 20 years ago. We called it a thing called DLAS, the Digital Language Assessment System, and it actually had a lot of input, and we consider it to be a forerunner of our first learning management system that we call affectionately old coursework, that then became new coursework, or Sakai. A key in using a learning management system or to developing it was to fulfill the dream of receiving and delivering audio and video content on the web so that we could enhance student performance. So Sakai enabled us to deliver audio and video prompts as well as to limit the number and length of responses. So I want to show you what this looks like. Students, as I said, needed to practice on their own, and I don't mean drilling like we used to do in the old lab. But we developed 2 modules within coursework. One was, for example, on listening. It was called an oral diagnostic assessment. So this is the one you see in listening. A video comes up, and then, of course, there's several questions afterwards to assess comprehension. This is the one that's more important to my heart. Again, a video comes up. The task is, I don't know if you can read this, it says, imagine you are being interviewed by a dating agency. What 5 adjectives best describe you? Describe yourself as accurately as possible. So there's a prompt in Spanish, and then the students have a certain period of time in which to respond. So now we're at the point, so we're getting beyond Sakai, we're at the point where we have to move to another learning management system. It's called Canvas, and here's how I feel about it. We are really back to the future with our move ahead toward Canvas. Well, Canvas can still carry audio and video prompts and responses. We can no longer control the attempts or the length of responses. So much for progress. I'm actually hopeful that this is just a minor setback, but at present, that kind of deficit in the learning management system potentially brings a deficit in the foreign language learning. So we're working on this, worried about it, but let me keep going. Our next stage after placement testing and that kind of practice that I just showed you was the need to check on the oral proficiency outcomes of students completing sequences of language learning. So you see where I've gone from placement, practice, outcomes. So thank God, unlike with placement testing, we don't have to do all of that assessment all within 1 hour. We did have a lab, and we knew we could file students in there. But how do we get all of those assessments ready? And remember, we're talking about from Arabic to Zulu in the types of assessments we're doing. We actually did them in 14 different languages. So the first thing we had to do, of course, was rip out all those unsightly booths and install computers. But we also needed an automatic delivery of tests and a convenient way of delivering student performance. So what you'll see now is how we actually delivered this through the learning management system. So here's just a shot of a young man in the language lab taking an exam within the coursework environment. But it really came down to this. Okay, so that was 2008. By 2015, we were conducting 800 Soapies in this particular fashion. Of course, there continued to be the need to get those performances conveniently to instructors, so we do that upload-download magic. And here's a slide. Here's an example of the assessment tool that our instructors use. Instructors can go into the coursework website. They can work through whatever assessment that they've asked. They can work through it per item or per student. Again, we have important research findings after having done this very elaborate process of placement, practice, exit. Here's a research finding that we're all very proud of. Our students at Stanford reached the oral proficiency level in 2 years that most students at other universities reach as majors. So of course, none of that was enough. You didn't laugh through the dance of the bees, but I thought you would. That wasn't enough. We need to go back to learning theory. All of that I've shown you was focused on only one skill, and that was speaking. And learning theory tells us that learners need to have multiple opportunities and relevant contexts in which to capture what they are learning. For language teachers, that means speaking about things, writing about them, and reading about them. So we moved to writing. By 2006, there was a standardized protocol for the assessment of foreign language writing. In parallel to the oral diagnostics that I showed you, the listening and speaking one, we also developed written diagnostics. We had instructors who knew how to create writing prompts and how to administer them, but we had to deliver the prompts in a secure fashion. So here's what we did. Okay. Oh, thank you for that. What you do have to do is multiply that scene about, 65 times, because that's the number of sections that we had going, so we had armies of people running around, like you just saw there. So again, there was another big oops moment. We needed some kind of computer delivery. So again, we had character set problems. We had space problems because you have to deliver something in a space, and we did need those computers. So we purchased a set of netbooks, and we set aside a room in which to administer the writing assignments. So here's what that looks like. Again, all of this was being carried through coursework. So there were problems when a student would try to upload an answer, and all these kids were uploading, downloading all at the same time, but we managed to get through this. And we conducted some interesting research. Again, sort of an intuitive finding, typing rather than handwriting was much more efficacious for students. I have to say, in spite of the intuitive obviousness of this, if that isn't too redundant, there was considerable resistance to having students type. The instructors wanted students sitting there using a paper and pencil. So anyway, by the time the second year rolled around, you do a small version and then you have to expand, we needed more rooms to accommodate more students, and we needed more computers. Enter the Stanford electric shop. In order to plug in all those computers, we needed more places to plug them in. So the electric shop team arrived in building 30, and we were told that if we did everything we wanted to do, we would blow all the circuits on the quad. So, and then you say, do we really want to blow the circuits in the president's office? I don't think so. So they came up with this brilliant solution. Top left is bringing power down from some central location through the attics on the quad. The power came down the side of building 30, wrapped around all these things at the bottom, all these cables, and then went back in the window in building 30, plugged into a generator, and then we plugged the computers into the generator. Okay, you should be laughing. It looked absolutely hilarious. Anyway, and there were people walking by watching this scene, this circus, because this had to go on for 2 weeks with, hey, I thought this was Silicon Valley. So at the time, we often said to ourselves, hey, we can't be the only ones with this problem. We're trying to assess students, give them a lot of opportunity to write on the computer. So we did discover that other people were using technology. It was called paper and pencil. And here's what that looked like, blue books and paper and pencil. This was in the summer of 2013, okay? So there was clearly a need to deliver material via a network and send it off for assessment. And a critical dimension to that sort of system was unplugging the internet for the duration of the assessment. We didn't want language learners cutting and pasting from foreign newspapers or looking up forms in an online grammar help system. We did discover that we were not alone, that the biz school and the law school each had such a need. Again, this is all driven by yet another learning need, and that is what I call release of control, providing learners with an opportunity to submit the richest performance possible within a limited time frame. And that's what brings us to the present time and a big project called HST, or high stakes testing. So before I look to the future, I want to call your attention to some things that I imagine have crossed your mind as I chronicled our experience. There were financial, political, and psychological costs to what I just showed you. We estimated in a recent article that we have spent, just in Spanish and French, but that's the lion's share of what we do, a little more than $380,000 since 1999. So that comes down to around $29,000 a year. That includes the salaries that we pay instructors for assessment. It includes anything that goes into test development for both Soapies, the simulated oral proficiency interviews, and the writing prompts, and the technology whenever we need to purchase large quantities of netbooks or desktops for the digital language lab. This brings us to somewhere between $200 and $250 a student. That's just on the Language Center's dime. If you include the costs of developers, I couldn't possibly tell you how much that would be. By political costs, I mean the occasions when I had to go hat in hand or I had to ask for special assistance. That's never easy. Although I will say I was able, with those photographs from the electric shop, to entertain the provost one afternoon, with the technology-based solutions to language testing offered by them. And psychological costs, there were stomach-churning moments when it looked like things might not go our way. Changing a learning management system is pretty heart-stopping when all your learning is hooked up with that system. When we first moved to Sakai, the Soapy wasn't ready, so we had to use the old Soapy version that we had, which meant we had to downgrade the computers to Windows NT. And when we did that, we forgot a security setting, and the whole lab was infected by a virus. So that meant we had to shut down the lab for a couple of days. So that was 2007. And that was really a scary time because it looked like the entire system was going to collapse. But now, new stomach churning, and that's over Canvas. But I think such is technology. And I want to end with some comments about how we really pulled this off. So, sure, we had these really significant research bases for guidance, and that was key. So we knew about second language learning, we knew about learning in general. That was great. But we also had support from the highest levels of the university to make all of what I just talked about happen. At every turn, I knew that Building 1, that's where the Humanities and Sciences office is, and Building 10, that's where the president is. We knew that from both of those buildings, there was a desire for the language programs to succeed and a willingness to understand. I cannot overestimate the importance of 2 presidents and 2 provosts who were clear in thinking that language learning was important. I rarely had to go through major hoops to get resources, whether that was for the digital language lab or ultimately the resources for the prototype for the high-stakes testing module. When the university saw results, that is, higher performing students, that is, real learning, it responded very, very positively. In like manner, these attitudes were held by the next level of bureaucracy. Our university librarian was committed to language learning, and that's where technology was seated at the time. What we wanted to do was consistent with his beliefs and his experiences. This commitment then became part of his shop, a commitment from the Academic Technology Specialist Program, and frankly, all of Soul Air, Stanford University Libraries, academic information resources. Doesn't exist anymore, but it's a crowd of people who are still here. I generally didn't have to go begging and explaining. I confronted people, especially in Soul Air, who did everything they could to understand our needs. And now I'm blessed that the attitude has continued within our new structure. That's the VPTL structure. So here's how I see it. We live in an environment where we don't have technology gurus doing their own thing. They always, in my experience, had a service mentality, which meant they had to do my thing. So I acknowledge this. I'm really eternally grateful for this. Most individuals in my field, and perhaps in yours, are not as privileged. They have to deal with a technical bureaucracy that often seems to run independent of learning. So, we live in app land. I get calls each week from some developer who wants to either sell something or use our students as guinea pigs to try out whatever. I always ask them about the learning theory that they've used on which to base their product, and I get silence. And actually, they go away to sell their wares to somebody else who perhaps cannot resist bright, shiny objects or cannot resist some kind of cool factor without learning. So, I'm going to end here. I showed you some goofy things this morning. I hope you enjoyed what I showed you. But one of the things I was trying to do was to underline that we never asked for developer time or for new hardware without having tried things out in a snail-like fashion. And further, we always collected learning data on everything that we did, so whenever I asked for the next step, I was able to provide the learning data that was so important. And I hope that I've convinced you that we always had pedagogy leading technology, not the other way around. So thank you very much for your attention.
Hi, Jen Stringer from UC Berkeley. We just made the move from Sakai to Canvas, and one of the things that we're doing is building LTI tools that we're hosting locally to provide the functionality that some faculty are missing. And I'm wondering, maybe you can answer the question, maybe somebody else in the room, is that what you're looking at in terms of the solution to the two Canvas pieces that you were missing, the time to, and also, we've been very successful actually in pushing that vendor when we'd like them to make changes on particular things. So I'm hoping that you're doing that as well.
Actually, Ken has to answer that. I cannot answer it technically.
We're taking sort of a threefold approach to that right now. The existing audio, the media assignments in Canvas, we're trying those out. They do not have the restrictions that we would like, the sort of control over the number of attempts and the time that we can get the students to respond. We're going to see how that goes for a quarter. We're also exploring the possibility of taking the high-stakes testing tool as an LTI tool and putting it back in. That's somewhat limiting because then you can't put in multiple choice things. The multiple choice and short answer forms within Canvas are quite robust and quite good. They fit inside the app that goes on multiple systems. And also we're looking outside. Are there other things like VoiceThread or something else that might be able to do that? Right now we're sort of in this transition period. The Canvas team has been very cooperative, putting a lot of effort into working with us to make sure that that happens, and we're confident that we'll find a positive solution.
Thank you for a great presentation, and thank you for always putting learning ahead of technology to go along with technology. And moving to Canvas, I think many of the lecturers here, especially at the Language Center, were very nervous about the move. That picture you showed was sort of representing our feeling as well. And I think part of it is the fact that we have so much material already on coursework. I was wondering if it's going to be sort of seamless to export that material onto Canvas, or is it going to require perhaps training workshops and such?
I'm going to have Ken answer that again.
Okay, Ken again.
Or someone, or John.
Everything is going to happen smoothly and flawlessly.
Thank you, John.
That's what I was hoping the answer would be. I'll be in John's office shortly to make sure of that.
I'm glad you have a sense of humor, too.
I think the very short answer is yes, obviously.
So you've talked a lot about applying learning theory and research to the problems that you're confronting, facing the challenges that you're overcoming. And I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to that process. Every research study out there sort of underspecifies what should be done in any given situation, and yet you've done a great job, as I understand it, of applying research. And I'd like to know if you could talk a little bit about how you go about testing. You spoke about also doing things kind of in a paper or snail format before that. So I'd love to hear something about the way you have married research and practice in the work you're doing.
Oh, wow. Tough question. I think because I was a second language researcher, I always had that in my bones, and the collecting language learning data was actually the only thing I knew how to do. So I often, back when I was in that time in the provost, or when he was just an associate dean, but I thought this is the only way I know to do this, and I thought at the time, ooh, technology, I bet you there are other ways of doing this. So I think another person would have perhaps approached the issue in a different way. But the second language acquisition database is it's so deep and complex because of the complexity of the forms that you have to think about time on task and you have to think about appropriate feedback. And I don't know if that's a good enough question, but the learning data were always deeply ingrained. So I was about assessment before assessment became cool and then uncool.
But it's cool now.
Oh, is it? Okay. Okay. Thank you.